This week's lecture will be discussing the factors related to aerobic endurance performance, setting aerobic endurance training frequency based on training status, the sport season, and recovery requirements, assigning aerobic endurance training duration and understand its interaction with training intensity, and describe the various types of aerobic endurance programs. Also, we will address the issues of cross-training, detraining, tapering, recovery, and resistance training when designing an aerobic endurance training program. Aerobic endurance exercise and competitions are popular and are available to almost everyone, so it's often believed that those who train long will perform well. But one of the things is that reaching performance goals in aerobic endurance sports requires an understanding of multiple factors, including the basic physiology behind endurance performance, exercise economy, the principles of aerobic endurance training, performance psychology, and the overall lifestyle. Also, understanding the basic physiology of aerobic endurance exercise and the expected training adaptations can give you a little bit more insight on the importance of program design for aerobic athletes. For a training adaptation to occur, a physiological system must be exercised at a level beyond that to which it is presently accustomed. So, we'll go over some physiological adaptations to aerobic endurance training. Aerobic metabolism is the production of energy from the breakdown of carbohydrates and fats in the presence of oxygen. With this can produce an abundant amount of energy, but it does so at a much slower rate than anaerobic metabolism. Anaerobic metabolism is the production of energy from the breakdown of carbohydrates in the absence of oxygen. This produces energy at a faster rate than aerobic metabolism, but is less efficient. Cardiovascular endurance is the response of the heart and vasculature to aerobic endurance training. So as you become more trained, there's an increase in cardiac output, increase in stroke volume, and also an increase in capillary density, which leads to additional blood flow and delivery of oxygen into the muscles. Maximal oxygen consumption, or VO2 max, is the greatest amount of oxygen that can be used at the cellular level for the entire body. It is often related to cardiorespiratory fitness. VO2 max is the product of cardiac output times arteriovenous difference. So as your fitness improves, so should your VO2 max. In general, we see higher VO2 max values in healthy individuals, male individuals, trained individuals, and in younger individuals. Another terminology to know is resting oxygen uptake. This is the amount of oxygen uptake at rest, which is 3.5 milliliters per kg per minute. This value is defined as 1 metabolic equivalent, or 1 met. Lactate threshold is the speed of movement or the percentage of VO2 max at which a specific blood lactate concentration is observed, or the point at which blood lactate concentration begins to increase above resting levels. Lactate threshold is also referred to as anaerobic threshold. The lactate threshold usually appears around 50 to 60% of VO2 max in untrained individuals. However, when we look at trained individuals, this occurs at a higher rate, such as 65 to 80% of VO2 max. We mentioned that maximal oxygen consumption, or VO2 max, is the product of cardiac output times arteriovenous difference. But what cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped by the heart in liters per minute. We can calculate cardiac output by multiplying stroke volume times heart rate. Normally, cardiac output is around 5 liters per minute. Also, when we look at this value, women generally have a lower value compared to males. But when we start exercising, cardiac output can increase 5 to 6 times above its baseline or resting values. When we look at stroke volume, this is the quantity of blood ejected with each beat and is usually around 70 milliliters. This variable is important because it's involved in calculating cardiac output, and also it's important in the adaptations as stroke volume increases with aerobic training. It is important to know some of the physiological adaptations that occur acutely with aerobic exercise and the adaptations with chronic aerobic training. You can see here with the acute aerobic exercise, there's an increase in cardiac output, an increase in stroke volume, an increase in heart rate, and an increase in oxygen uptake. Also, there's an increase in systolic blood pressure and increasing blood flow to the active muscles, and a decrease in diastolic blood pressure. When we look at the chronic adaptations to aerobic training, there is a reduced body fat, increased maximal oxygen uptake, increased running economy, increased respiratory capacity, lower blood lactate concentrations at submaximal exercise, increased mitochondrial and capillary density, and an improved enzyme activity. So we won't go into the physiology behind these adaptations, but you'll learn these physiological adaptations in exercise physiology. When designing aerobic endurance training programs, it's important to understand the factors that influence and play a significant role in successful aerobic endurance performance. One of the factors is exercise economy. This is a measure of the energy cost of activity at a given exercise velocity. Athletes with a higher exercise economy expend less energy during exercise to maintain a given exercise velocity, such as running speed. Also, with an improvement in exercise economy, this can enhance maximal aerobic power and lactate threshold. One of the ways to improve exercise economy is through specificity. For example, to improve running time, the training should mainly be focused on running and not cycling or swimming. And since you are expending less energy due to this improved exercise economy, you are also delaying the fatigue process. There are some other running economy factors that also play a role. One is the stride length, as a comfortable natural stride length seems to be the most efficient for most runners. Second is body weight. This should be kept low, but still at a healthy level. Carrying too much fat mass or muscle mass may not allow for optimal efficiency in aerobic exercise. The last factor is air resistance. This is a little bit more difficult to control, but athletes can improve their economy by wearing tight-fitting clothing that doesn't catch the wind and by drafting behind other competitors in a race. Optimal performance in aerobic endurance events is based on being able to perform at the highest intensity for a given distance. A well-designed aerobic endurance training program is a lot more complex than just having athletes exercise at a high intensity for a long duration. A variety of training techniques in a structured training program can lead to optimal performance. An aerobic endurance training program should include workouts with different intensities and durations. Remember that specificity modality is very important for the athlete. If the athlete is a runner, then the athlete should perform mostly running workouts. If the athlete is a cyclist, then biking should be the main form of training. However, supplemental activities such as resistance training and nutrient timing can also play an important role in reaching optimal performance for the athlete. Psychology plays a large role in aerobic endurance performance. Athletes may be in top physiological shape, but if they aren't mentally prepared, they may see a decrease in their performance. Anxiety is commonly experienced before a competition. Some may think that anxiety is detrimental, however, it may actually benefit the athlete's performance, as this is usually transient. However, substantial anxiety can have a negative effect on the athlete's performance. Therefore, athletes should mentally prepare for the anxiety that will most likely occur before competition so that it won't have a negative impact on their performance. Mental state is also a factor during competition. There are two strategies utilized during endurance competition, which are association and dissociation. Association is being very aware of the physiological sensations of exertion, such as muscular pain, muscular fatigue, hydration, body temperature, and respiration. This strategy seems to optimize the athlete's efficiency and pace. Dissociation is the use of techniques to distract the athlete from the physical pain of the competition. This is linked to an increased risk of injury and hitting the wall. So out of the two, it seems to be more beneficial to be aware of the physiological sensations of an endurance competition, no matter how unpleasant it may be. Optimal performance in aerobic endurance competition requires dedication in training and overall lifestyle to bring about optimal recovery. Recovery is a very important part of the aerobic endurance training. Individuals who have a high aerobic fitness level can recover faster than individuals with lower aerobic capacities. So this is very important for the athlete on building base levels of aerobic fitness, not only for performance, but also to aid in recovery. Some factors that can affect recovery besides having a high level of fitness is having adequate sleep, a sufficient intake of high quality nutrients, and then other techniques such as massage, ultrasound therapy, etc. An effective aerobic endurance training program must be specific for the individual athlete. This requires manipulation of the primary program design variables such as exercise mode, training frequency, training intensity, exercise duration, and exercise progression. Exercise mode refers to the specific activity performed by the athlete, such as cycling, running, swimming, and so on. When training to improve aerobic endurance performance, the athlete should select activities that mimic as closely as possible the movement pattern employed in competition. The more specific the training mode is to the sport, the greater the improvement in performance for the athlete. Training frequency refers to the number of training sessions conducted per day or per week. The frequency of training sessions depends on the interaction of exercise intensity and duration, the training status of the athlete, and the specific sport season. If you have an athlete performing higher exercise intensity or in longer duration, it may require less frequent training to allow for sufficient recovery from exercise sessions. The training status of the athlete can also influence training frequency, with lesser trained athletes require more recovery days at the beginning of a training program than more highly trained athletes. The sports season that the athlete is currently in can also influence training frequency. An off-season program may include 5 days of training per week, but training frequency may progress to daily workouts in the preseason. Additionally, fewer training sessions may be required to maintain an achieved level of physiological function or performance than to attain that level initially. Having appropriate training frequency is important for the aerobic endurance athlete because too much training may increase the risk of injury, illness, or overtraining. The next step in designing an effective aerobic endurance training program is training intensity or training load. Training intensity can be both a qualitative and quantitative measure of how much effort is utilized during a training session. Central to causing training adaptations in the body is the interaction of training intensity and duration. Generally, the higher the exercise intensity, the shorter the exercise duration. So adaptations in the body are specific to the intensity or effort expended during a training session. However, there is a minimal training intensity threshold to improve fitness, and this is at 40 to 50% of VO2 max or 55 to 65% of maximal heart rate. When performing high-intensity aerobic exercise, this increases the cardiovascular and respiratory function and allows for improved oxygen delivery to the working muscles. Also, this may also benefit skeletal muscle adaptations by affecting muscle fiber recruitment. With a high intensity, there is a greater recruitment of type 2 muscle fibers. This training stimulus allows for those fibers to become more aerobically trained, thereby possibly improving overall aerobic performance. The regulation of exercise intensity is critical to the success of each training session and ultimately the entire program. An exercise intensity that is too low does not overload the body system and induce the desired physiological adaptations, whereas an intensity that is too high results in fatigue and a premature end to the training session. In either case, the training session will be poor and ineffective. A quantitative measure of intensity can be obtained using heart rate values and pace training. Using heart rate to determine exercise intensity is one of the most common training strategies for aerobic prescription. The reason for this is the close relationship between heart rate and oxygen consumption, particularly when the intensity is between 50 and 90% of VO2 max. Here you can see on the table on the right that shows the relationship between VO2 max, heart rate reserve, and the percentage of maximal heart rate. There are a couple different ways to calculate the intensity using heart rate. Probably the most popular or most common method is using a percentage of maximal heart rate. This is where you find the age-predicted maximum heart rate by taking 220 minus the individual's age. After you find the age-predicted maximum heart rate, you multiply that by some sort of exercise intensity. And with this intensity, you usually provide two different intensities, a lower intensity and a higher intensity, and this gives you the target heart rate range. However, using 220 minus age is not always accurate. If you have an individual less than 40 years old, it will overestimate the value, while having an individual over 40 years old, it will underestimate the value. Remember, these heart rate calculations are just giving you a ballpark number and not the actual heart rate itself. Another way to calculate the intensity using heart rate is using the Carvona method. This is where you are taking into account the resting heart rate. For this method, you will still take 220 minus age. Then you will take the age predicted maximum heart rate minus the individual's resting heart rate to find the heart rate reserve. To find the target heart rate, you will multiply heart rate reserve times exercise intensity plus the resting heart rate. And again, with this, you usually provide two different intensities, and this will give you the target heart rate range. Another example on determining exercise intensity is using exercise pace. This technique uses the results of past competitions to establish training intensities. So if you are training at distances longer than competition lengths, the intensity should be less than the goal pace for the competition. If you are performing shorter tempo activities, the pace should be faster than competition pace. And this is utilized not only for running, but can also be utilized for cycling and also swimming. Ratings of perceived exertion, or RPE, can also be used to regulate intensity during aerobic endurance training. The RPE scale ranges from 6 to 20, where 6 represents no exertion at all, and 20 represents maximal exertion. The theory behind the RPE scale is based off of heart rate, where 6 on the RPE scale represents 60 beats per minute, and 20 on the RPE scale represents 200 beats per minute. It appears that RPE can be used to accurately regulate intensity when there are changes in fitness level. However, RPE can be influenced by various external environmental factors such as passive distractors and environmental temperature. Nevertheless, RPE is a valid monitoring tool. Another method on prescribing exercise and intensity is metabolic equivalent, or MET. 1 MET is equal to 3.5 milliliters per kg per minute, and this is considered the amount of oxygen required by the body at rest. MET values have been determined for a variety of different physical activities. For example, an activity with a MET value of an 8 requires 8 times the oxygen uptake that is required by an individual at rest. The last one we'll go over is the power measurement. Cyclists may use power measuring cranks and hubs to monitor exercise intensity. However, due to expensive costs, these devices are probably suitable only for the top-level amateurs or professionals. Using power to monitor intensity in cycling has an advantage over other measures because metabolic rate is closely related to mechanical power production. The next program variable is exercise duration and volume. Exercise duration and volume are often interactively used interchangeably. Although the two terms are related, exercise duration refers to the length of time of a training session. The duration of a training session is often influenced by the exercise intensity. The longer the exercise duration, the lower the exercise intensity, and vice versa. Exercise volume incorporates both the intensity and duration of a training session. So just like resistance training, where the number of sets performed multiplied by the number of repetitions performed multiplied by the weight lifted is volume, the same method is applied to aerobic endurance training volume by multiplying the duration of exercise by the distance traveled and the exercise intensity, such as heart rate or pace. Once the athlete begins an aerobic endurance training program, they need to continue the program to either maintain or advance their aerobic fitness level. Progression of an aerobic endurance training program involves increasing the frequency, intensity, and duration of exercise. A general recommendation is that you should include at least one recovery or active rest day in each week of training. With exercise progression, exercise frequency, intensity, or duration should not increase more than 10% each week. If an athlete has a higher level of fitness, they will reach a point where it is not feasible to increase either the frequency or the duration of exercise. When this occurs, progression in training will occur only through exercise intensity manipulation. One of the most important things when it comes to progression on training intensity is that it should be monitored very carefully to avoid overtraining. The most common type of training identified with aerobic endurance sports is long, slow distance training, or LSD training. This uses a moderate intensity that is equivalent to 70% VO2 max or heart rate max. One thing though is that slow refers to a pace that is slower than typical race pace. During an LSD training session, the training distance should be greater than race distance, or the duration should be at least as long as 30 minutes up to 2 hours. The physiological benefits from LSD training include enhanced cardiovascular and thermoregulatory function, improved mitochondrial energy production and oxidative capacity of skeletal muscle, and an increase in fat utilization. These changes enhance the body's ability to clear lactate. Also, there's a shift of muscle fiber type to be more oxidative. The intensity during LSD training is slower than the intensity used during competition, and this may be a disadvantage if too much of this type of training is performed. Also, since LSD training generally constitutes a major portion of an aerobic endurance athlete's training volume, this is sometimes referred to as base training. Pace tempo training employs an intensity at or slightly higher than race competition intensity. The intensity corresponds to lactate threshold. There are two ways to conduct pace tempo training. One is steady, and the other is intermittent. Steady pace tempo training is continuous training conducted at an intensity equal to the lactate threshold for durations of approximately 20 to 30 minutes. The purpose of pace tempo training is to stress the athlete at a specific intensity and improve energy production from both aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. Intermittent pace tempo training is also referred to as tempo intervals, cruise intervals, or threshold training. During intermittent pace tempo training, the intensity is the same as for a steady threshold workout, but the training session consists of a series of shorter intervals with brief recovery periods between work intervals. The primary objective for this type of training is to develop a sense of race pace and enhance the body system's ability to sustain exercise at that pace. Pace tempo training also involves the same pattern of muscle fiber recruitment as is required in competition. The benefits derived from this type of training include improved running economy and increased lactate threshold. Interval training involves exercise at intensities close to VO2 max. The work interval should last between 3 and 5 minutes, although they can be as short as 30 seconds. The rest intervals for 3 to 5 minute work intervals should be equal to the work interval. The work to rest ratio should be 1 to 1. By performing interval training, this allows the athlete to train at intensities close to VO2 max for a greater amount of time than it would be possible in a single training session at a continuous high intensity. Interval training should not be performed until a firm base of aerobic endurance training has been attained, as this type of training is very stressful on the athlete and should be used sparingly. The benefits from interval training include an increase in VO2 max and an enhanced anaerobic metabolism. So we've talked about fartlek training in previous lectures. Not only can this type of training be used for running, but it can also be used for cycling and swimming. This type of training is likely to enhance VO2 max, increase the lactate threshold, and improve running economy and fuel utilization. High-intensity interval training, or HIIT, is a form of training that uses repeated high-intensity exercise bouts interspersed with brief recovery periods. For optimal stimulus, athletes need to spend several minutes within the HIIT session above 90% of VO2 max. One thing with HIIT training is that it may be beneficial for improving running speed and economy. This may be important toward the later stages of an aerobic endurance race when the final kick or push is needed to pass a competitor or set a record or personal best. As of lately, interval training has become very popular as a time-efficient training strategy for aerobic endurance athletes. Similar to traditional aerobic endurance training, interval training can result in improvements in cardiorespiratory and cardiovascular fitness, blood volume, lactate threshold, and muscle buffering capacity. These factors are necessary for improving performance and are similar to those adaptations seen with LSD training. For endurance athletes, the rest times between intervals are typically equal to or less than the work time itself, which keeps the work to rest ratio at 1 to 1 or 2 to 1. An example of an appropriate work to rest ratio for long interval HIIT training is between 2 to 3 minutes at or above 90% VO2 max, with a resting period of 2 minutes or less. Here are some examples of LSD training, pace tempo training, and interval training for athletes. The program design variables and the various types of aerobic endurance training are often applied to the athlete's sports season to create a yearly training program. The priority in off-season training is to develop a base of cardiorespiratory fitness. The training program should be composed of long duration and low intensity workouts at the beginning. As the off-season continues, intensity and, to a lesser extent, duration are increased. During the preseason, the athlete should focus on increasing intensity, maintaining or reducing duration, and incorporating all types of training into the program. During in-season or competition, the training program should be designed around competition with low intensity and short duration training just before race days so that the athlete is fully recovered and rested. In the postseason, the main focus should be on recovering from the previous competitive season. Low training duration and intensity are typical for this phase, but enough overall exercise or activity should be performed to maintain a sufficient level of cardiorespiratory fitness, muscular strength, and lean body mass. It is important to consider other related issues when developing an aerobic endurance training program besides the program design variables. These include cross-training, detraining, tapering, recovery, and resistance training. Cross-training is a mode of training that can be used to maintain general conditioning in athletes during periods of reduced training due to injury or during recovery from a training cycle. Cross-training may reduce the likelihood of overuse injuries because it distributes the physical stress of training to muscle groups different from those used during training. Detraining occurs when the athlete reduces the training duration or intensity or stops training altogether due to a break in the training program, injury, or illness. In the absence of an appropriate training stimulus, the athlete experiences a loss of the physiological adaptations brought by training. Some of these adaptations we see with detraining is that there is a rapid decrease in VO2 max. Within the first 12 days, there's an 8% decrease in VO2 max, and after 84 days, there's a 20% decrease in VO2 max. Other adaptations lost with detraining is a decrease in stroke volume, which is due to a rapid loss of plasma volume. Also, there is a decrease in maximal arteriovenous difference, which is due to a decrease in mitochondria and a decrease in oxidative capacity of the muscle. There is also a shift of type 2A fibers to type 2X. The initial decrease in VO2 is due to a decrease in stroke volume, and as time goes on, the decrease in VO2 is due to a decrease in arteriovenous difference. Tapering is an important component of the training program as aerobic endurance athletes prepare for major competition. Tapering involves the systematic reduction of training duration and intensity, combined with an increased emphasis on technique work and nutritional intervention, such as carb loading. The objective of tapering the training regimen is to attain peak performance at the time of competition. In general, tapering should last between 7 and 16 days. Probably the most overlooked aspect of aerobic endurance training is recovery. Due to the high volume and sometimes high intensity aspects of aerobic endurance training, overtraining is a significant risk to aerobic endurance athletes. Overtraining is the result of too much stress, both physiological and psychological, while also not getting enough rest. There are some other variables as well that may be playing a role in overtraining, such as the progression rate, where you may be progressing the athlete too quickly, or that their nutritional intake is not optimal. Overtraining is defined as prolonged fatigue and underperformance that follows a heavy period of training or competition. Not only is there a decrease in performance, but there's also other symptoms with overtraining, such as lack of motivation, sleep and mood disturbances, and weight loss. However, this is highly individualized. Recovery from overtraining may take up to 5 weeks. Sometimes it may be months, and in very rare cases, years to recover. Overtraining is very tricky as the threshold is different for each athlete. Since there are no warning signs or symptoms, coaches do not realize that the athlete is overtrained until it's too late. So as a strength and conditioning professional, you can prevent this through periodized training and also providing adequate recovery days. Also, it is important for the athlete to have an adequate caloric intake, which can be developed by a registered dietitian. Resistance training is an important factor in improving performance in aerobic endurance athletes. Some benefits from resistance training include an improvement in short-term exercise performance, faster recovery from injuries, prevention of overuse injuries and reduction of muscle imbalances, and stamina. Increased strength is important as it can improve hill climbing, bridging gaps between competitors during breakaways from groups, and the final sprint. Traditional resistance programs for aerobic endurance athletes have been designed using low-intensity exercises, high repetitions, short rest periods for 2 to 3 sets. The training frequency will be dependent on the training season. Although traditional resistance training program improves muscular endurance, explosive strength training is a more effective method for improving running economy and performance for aerobic endurance athletes. Remember, the strength training program should be specific to the athlete's goal. For example, incorporating the squat exercise into the training program may reduce the risk for lower body injury, which is common in endurance athletes. In summary, the primary mode of training for aerobic endurance athletes should be the mode in which they compete. Specificity of training is important to improve exercise economy and overall performance. Also, calculations of training volume for aerobic endurance athletes should take intensity, duration, and distance into account. Intensity can be monitored by using heart rate or by comparing exercise pace to past competition results. New research has established that combining traditional long-duration training with moderate duration and intense short-duration methods such as pace tempo training, fartlek training, and interval training yields the same or better results for performance. Also, resistance training may also be a valuable addition for aerobic endurance athletes. Tapering is the reduction of training volume prior to competition in order to improve performance. The tapering phase typically lasts 7 to 16 days. And lastly, due to the volume and intensity of many aerobic endurance training plans, overtraining is a significant risk to endurance athletes.